So before this video begins, I need to address the situation. In case you somehow haven't heard, Amazon has pulled the plug on the fourth Stargate show. Sorry I'm so behind on this topic. A change in my schedule has left me with little time to work on videos, as evident by the lack of videos recently. I do plan to try and fix that, but getting back to the situation, I don't want to get too sidetracked into this. But the whole drama surrounding it is that the executives felt that the new show, which would have been a continuation of the last three, wouldn't have a reach beyond Stargate's core audience, which has rightfully been called out as BS by people who were working on the show, who designed it to be a jumping off point for new viewers. Better people than me have documented this situation and the oddness surrounding it. This can be a whole video in of itself that I just don't have time to work on. As I type this, there's been no word on what comes next. There are petitions and emails you can sign and send to try and convince Amazon to change their decision, which I'll have on screen now. I know some people see these as pointless, but consider that Mail originally saved Star Trek, and the petition from a few years ago to bring Stargate back was noticed by Amazon. These things do matter. It might take time for us to see the result of it, but it can lead to change. And the response I've seen from fans as well as writers and actors is honestly very moving. I've seen a few bad takes in this response, but the rest are kind of inspiring, and I can't help but hope that this decision will be overturned. I would have no greater joy if that's what dates this video. For now, I think the best way forward for me is to keep doing what I've been doing. Amazon may move forward with a new Stargate for a new audience, which is the rumor that is their plan, but I'll still be here making videos about the franchise we all love. With all that out of the way, welcome to another Stargate video. In my Replicators vs. Osurans video, I made the comment that Sokar and Anubis are very similar to one another, and someone got confused and honestly kind of pissed at me for that comment. Now, to be fair, there are key differences between the two. I will explore those in this video, but like, in broad strokes, let's look at the backstory and overall plot these two had, because it's basically the same thing. Both were rogue system lords expelled from the Empire and long thought dead. Both returned and ended up becoming major threats on a galactic scale. Both represented gods of death in the show's mythology. Unlike the other system lords, who try to look as human as possible, these two have a more inhuman look to varying degrees. Sokar is the more human-looking of the two, though he has a Palpatine-like look to him. Meanwhile, Anubis has a more Skeletor look to him, at least when he has his own face in the lower planes. On the note of looks, their robes and hoods are almost the same. I think the only difference is Sokar's is more red and a bit more bedazzled than Anubis's mostly black cloak. The end of both their stories are also similar. Sokar is killed and Apophis takes control of his fleet and becomes the next big threat. With Anubis, he wasn't killed. Ultimately, his story ends by being locked in eternal combat with Oma, but he is defeated at the Battle of Antarctica, and Baal took control of most of his holdings and became the next big threat. Yes, Anubis still played a role, later becoming the master of Baal, but he wasn't out commanding armies the same way he was when he first showed up. And just to add the cherry on top of all of this, both were played by the same actor. Again, there are differences in the details, but just overall the two are very similar to one another, and it does feel like they repeated the same storyline twice. To be clear, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, just something that you notice when watching. And this does lead to a fun idea to explore: who'd win in a fight if these two ever met? And unlike the Replicator versus video, we don't have to try and find some story reason for the two to fight. Both are Goa'uld, who are famous for not getting along and could fight for literally any reason. Could be they want the same resource, they could see the others a threat to their future plans, heck, maybe they view the other as copying them and take issue with that. I wasn't sure how I wanted to start this examination, but I think the best way is to look at how and when both chose to re-enter the galactic scene, because I think it says something about both. Starting with the how, Sokar returned by sort of jumping into the spotlight. He attacked Apophis, and we later learned he'd been building up his forces to launch a massive attack against 6 key system lords. which would have left him as the dominant power in the galaxy. Anubis took a different approach. He'd been working behind the scenes for some time. For example, when the Tolan were destroyed, O'Neill blamed the System Lords, but they denied any knowledge of the event. And in a rare case of honesty from them, they were telling the truth. They didn't know anything about the attack, as it was carried out by an agent of Anubis, Tanith. When he did make his official return, he did start out by attacking various System Lords, but it's important to remember these attacks were not designed to cripple them. These attacks served a few purposes. First, it was to set each System Lord back militarily, to sow distrust among them, and absorb some of their forces into his own. My personal headcanon is he did this to show his power to the others so he could rejoin the Empire, which makes sense if you look at it from a hard power standpoint. It's hard to deny one's legitimacy if they have the power to back it up, and even with that, Anubis' agents attempted to employ some diplomatic options. An offer was made that he would destroy the Tau'ri since the Protected Planets Treaty that prevented the System Lords from attacking Earth didn't really cover a System Lord who had been dead for 1,000 years. Yes, Anubis wanted total domination and ultimately did end up fighting against a united alliance of System Lords, but at the start of his return, he didn't just come in and declare himself Emperor. When it comes to, well, the when these two chose to re-enter the scene is also interesting. While the Empire was weakened and in slight chaos due to the death of Ra, the feudal nature of the Goa'uld meant that they were still somewhat stable as an empire. When Sokar chose to make his move, there were still plenty of powerful System Lords still around. Kronos, Yu, Hera, and at least 3 others were still on the board. Yes, he had a plan to take over, and the Tok'ra seemed convinced his invasion would have succeeded, but let's take a look at when Anubis entered the scene. Again, he had been working in the shadows, but when he did choose to make his official return, it was at the System Lords Summit, which was being held to sell the power vacuum caused by the deaths of Kronos and Apophis. Said power vacuum had caused massive fighting and losses between various System Lords over several months. I actually recall a conversation between Jack and Jacob, where Jacob pointed out how the Tau'ri killing so many older but more stable System Lords was leading to problems, as younger, less stable System Lords were on the rise. So these remaining System Lords were A, weakened due to months of fighting, and B, were probably not as powerful as the others who had been killed by this point. As a matter of fact, we were told during the episode that there is only one System Lord left from the time Anubis was first around. So these System Lords present are younger and don't have as established bases, at least in comparison to the old guard who are all dead besides you. The Empire was probably in the weakest state it could have been when Anubis made his return. I think the how and when these two chose to return says one of two things about each from a military and personality standpoint. For Sokar, I'd say this shows his strategy and mindset were more in line with traditional Goa'uld tactics. Come in with a big force, overwhelm the enemy, and assume dominance at the end. Which, if you look at it in a negative light, you could say shows him to be kind of dumb given he didn't wait till more System Lords had died. But that's hindsight, as who could have guessed so many powerful and ancient System Lords would have died in such a short amount of time. Something else to consider is that Sokar is known to be one of the more sadistic Goa'uld, so his decision to attack when he did might have been motivated by a desire for revenge, to torture those who originally dethroned him in the first place. I'd be willing to bet Ra and Apophis were both on Sokar's list of 6 key System Lords to attack, and he'd probably look forward to taking those 2 out since they were part of the alliance that kicked him out the first time. But then Ra died via nuke to the face, and Apophis was weakened after his failed attack on Earth. Sokar already lost his chance to torture Ra, he probably didn't want to lose his chance on Apophis. For Anubis, I think the strategy was more surgical and mindful, attack the System Lords, weaken them overall, while sowing discourse among them. Ball gives us a pretty interesting insight on how the System Lords viewed this tactic.
Such as war. No. This is different. This enemy attacks like a coward. They are becoming more frequent while the identity of our antagonist continues to elude us.
Now, I don't think this tactic is cowardly. However, one could argue that this is a tactic used if one couldn't afford to lose any forces in a direct fight. Ball even says this at one point.
Anubis may have grown strong, but he does not outweigh the collective power of the System Lords.
And that's kind of proven to be true consistently and again throughout the series. This is speculation and you could argue against it, but Anubis was hidden for some time, so he might not have had as large a base of power to build ships or raise armies, at least in comparison to Sokar, who didn't have to worry about staying hidden as much. One of the similarities I talked about between the two is that both were thought long dead, and that's technically not true for Sokar. Apophis thought he was dead, but the Tok'ra knew he was still alive since they had spies in his ranks. Sokar was originally banished by Kronos, not supposedly killed like Anubis was, and he seemingly still had agents active in the galaxy. So other system lords could have known he was alive, but didn't consider him a threat worth dealing with. The best way I can think to explain this is think of Sokar like Spain. Once long ago, it was the greatest power of its time, but nowadays, it's not even a blip on the radar in geopolitics. Obviously, the difference is that Sokar is building up a fleet in secret to regain power, something Spain isn't doing.
Or so the Germans would have us believe.
Anyway, my point is that Sokar had a bit more freedom to do things without everyone being shocked that he was alive. Anubis might not have had as large a dominion, or any at all that he could pull on, meaning at the start Anubis would not have a large force. However, there's one last factor to consider for a possible battle between the two: relative level of technology. I see a lot of people assume Sokar had access to a lot of advanced technology, and I kind of disagree. As far as I can tell, the only two unique technologies Sokar had were the particle accelerator and the cloaked attack vessels. And it's not that those two technologies aren't impressive, but I just don't think they really amount to much when you compare them to similar uses of similar technology. For example, Anubis used a Stargate destroyer to effectively do the same thing Sokar tried to do with the particle accelerator, and the Tari went on to use their own particle accelerator. The cloaking is impressive, but we know other system lords did experiment with that technology. I also find it kind of weird that we only saw this when Apophis took control of Sokar's forces after his death. Like, I'll assume it was something Sokar had, but kind of odd we only see it under Apophis. You compare this to Anubis, who had ships that could go toe-to-toe with the Asgard, and it's not really a competition. And if you look at ground forces, it gets worse, as Anubis had Coal Warriors and Ninja Jaffa. Admittedly, I don't recall the Ninja Jaffa doing much, but the Coal Warriors were absolute menaces on the battlefield. There's also the fact that Anubis is half ascended and has access to some of that knowledge. He's limited and can only do things he could have done when he was not ascended, but still, that gives him a big edge when it comes to technology. Now, I will be fair to Sokar, he did have a very large fleet, and if we assume the cloaking was something Sokar had, that does give him a big advantage. Sokar's Necropolis Guard could be useful. Now, in the show, they didn't do much besides look cool, but according to the Living Gods RPG, their armor was considerably more durable and offered more protection compared to the armor used by most other Jaffa. Can they go toe-to-toe with Coal Warriors? No, but keep in mind, Anubis didn't really have those till after his return, which is an interesting issue I noticed. A lot of the achievements we saw from Anubis only came about after his return. Using the Coal Warriors again, Anubis only learned how to make symbiotes as blank slates from Jonas, who learned about it on Pangera. Another example is the shields that let the Goa'uld ships stand up to the Asgard. We only saw those after Anubis made his return, though funny enough, the episode that showed this was the first time we got to see Anubis, and that was after the shields got used. That event led to Anubis gaining access to some Asgard technology, but again, this would be a post-return thing. Now, I do think Anubis had been working on the shield tech for some time, given that this allowed him to wipe out the Tolan, since their ion cannons couldn't just blow his ships up as usual. And Sokar also suffers from this problem, as the big massive fleet he was working on was still in production until sometime around when his story arc began in SG1. Depending on when I set this battle, it would determine if Sokar had a decent sized fleet or a massive one. To give a quick sum up of where we stand with both Goa'uld, Sokar had a small dominion, but it had the resources to build up a powerful fleet and army to conquer the rest of the galaxy. He might have had some advanced tech such as cloaking, but seems to have been at the same level as the others. Anubis, on the other hand, seems to have had an even smaller dominion compared to Sokar, assuming he had one at all. He had access to advanced technology, partly due to his ascended nature. However, most of the tech he's known for, he wouldn't have till sometime after his return. At most, he would have slightly better shields, maybe better weapons, and his ninja Jaffa. I tried thinking of when to set this battle, and I have two places in the timeline I want to look at. A pre-Ra Death era and a post-Ra Death era. And the reason for fighting could be anything really, though I did have an interesting idea I wanted to share. To be clear, I'm not saying this is canon or theory, it's at most just fan speculation. Basically, remember I talked about the similarities between these two, even down to the visuals? Well, what if in-universe that wasn't a coincidence? What if Anubis and Sokar worked together? I'm of the opinion that between the two, Anubis is the smarter and more dangerous one. So what if sometime after Sokar was first banished, Anubis approached him with the resources he would need to rebuild? This would have been part of a larger plan by Anubis, where Sokar would take up the burden of fighting and weakening the Empire as a whole. Meanwhile, Anubis would have worked in secret to develop more advanced technology, such as the shields, so he could build his own fleet and army to take over the remains of Sokar's and the Empire's weakened states. Think of it like the relationship between the First Order and Final Order in the Star Wars sequel trilogy. I apologize for referencing that trilogy, but it's the closest thing I could think of to this. And again, I'm not saying this is canon or the reason that they're fighting in this what if, it's just a fun idea I wanted to share. Starting off with the first scenario, a few years before Ra died, both were in exile from the Empire. They come across one another and fight! To be honest, I feel like I have to give it to Sokar based on what we know each group would have had at this point in time. Sokar had an established base of power, probably having some of that big fleet of his ready to use. However, I should note this is a case of Sokar winning the battle and not the war. This is an odd situation because Anubis can't really die or be tortured. Even if Sokar wipes out Anubis' forces, Anubis can just come back. Heck, Anubis might look at Sokar's forces and be like, oh, that's cool, I might just take control of your body and take control of your stuff. Sure, Sokar's body would begin to decay, and there's an argument that Anubis can't do that to a body with a symbiote, but being a pure energy being, I'm sure he could take control of the symbiote or just override the symbiote's control of the body. But let's say that Anubis just can't do that. The worst case is Anubis loses and Sokar takes control of some of his stuff. But Anubis can't die, so he falls back to some other secret base he has. Again, Sokar wins the battle, but now he's on Anubis' list for when he makes his move. Now, some might point to the timeline in Continuum where Baal took control of the Empire as an example of people beating Anubis in the lower planes. He's not present, so obviously it's possible to beat him. Which, sure, but the thing is, Baal has a lot of advantages Sokar just wouldn't have. He has future knowledge. Heck, he could just use his time machine to go back and kill Anubis before he ascended. There's also the fact he used to work for Anubis, so if there is a way to stop him, he would know. And that's assuming Baal did deal with him. It could just be that given Baal's ruling over a strong empire, that Anubis wouldn't make a move. For a post-Ra death, I actually have a bit more of a setup for the fight, involving some timeline changes. Namely, Sokar doesn't die. He loses most of his fleet and armies to Apophis, but retains enough that he can control most of his dominion. However, due to this setback, he doesn't go forward with his plan to take control of the Empire. Everything else still plays out mostly the same. Apophis becomes a major threat again, he kills Hera-Ur, SG-1 kills Kronos, and Apophis ultimately meets his end surrounded by bugs. The death of these system lords leads to the power vacuum and infighting. The difference here is that Sokar is around to take advantage of it. He begins attacking the others, and this allows him to rebuild his forces that he lost to Apophis and becomes a major threat to the others. Maybe this leads them to having the summit sooner, and it's here Anubis makes his presence known. He might have taken advantage to attack some of the others, but he or one of his agents is here to offer his aid against Sokar. The offer is accepted, but part of the deal is that Anubis has to take out Sokar alone. I'd imagine this is Yu's suggestion. He might distrust Anubis, but can see the let them fight opportunity here. Let the two big threats battle it out, and they can hopefully clean up whoever is left. In this scenario, both are relatively equal in terms of fleet power, it just comes down to strategy and technology. Strategy-wise, I'm not sure which either would do. At this point, both are now in the open, so stealth really isn't a thing. I'm sure at this point word of Sokar's cloaking ships would be somewhat known to the other system lords, so Anubis should be able to prepare for a situation like that if he has to at all. While I did say stealth wouldn't be a thing, Anubis in these events still only recently came back onto the scene, so his bag of tricks wouldn't be as well known. So for example, Sokar might try that trick Apophis used, having half the fleet cloaked to surprise the enemy, but with better shields on Anubis' ships, he could come out the winner. There is precedent for this in Stargate. These wouldn't be the Asgard-proof shields, but if we set this further in the timeline, then Anubis would have that and the Cold Warriors. A little add-on here because I forgot about it, the motherships used by each. Now, I did say Apophis did take some of Sokar's fleet in this timeline, which would include the mothership, and presumably he would have died on it like he did in the Prime one. But for the sake of argument and exploring this idea, let's say Sokar either had a backup, or maybe Apophis didn't get that ship. Sokar's mothership is said to have a faster hyperdrive, superior shields, and weapons that can penetrate attack shields at full strength, taking about 6 shots. I suppose that does hurt my argument from earlier that Sokar didn't have a lot of advanced technology. However, given these technologies are only seen on his mothership, my best guess is that this ship is sort of like Sokar's Bismarck or Yamato. It was his big epic ship, but had technology that was not present on his other ships. Anubis doesn't seem to have made this decision, as again, we see his ships stand up to Asgard ships, but I'm willing to bet he gave his own ship its own special toys. As for standard stuff, the ship had numerous heavy plasma turrets and carried over 50 death gliders. The ship also had advanced shields, where the only weapons known to pierce these shields were the ancient drone weapons. However, they did have a weakness. In an atmosphere, the shield's strength is reduced to 40% effectiveness. Though I doubt Sokar would be able to find out about this, or that this situation would come up. I think it's also important to remember that this ship is technically a platform for a super weapon that can either destroy multiple ships at once, or can decimate entire land masses. Though I doubt it would be a factor in this battle, as Anubis would need the 6 eyes to power the thing, but depending on how big of a threat Sokar is in this timeline, he could negotiate with the others to have them handed over. I doubt it would work, but it's not an entirely 0% chance. One last point to consider is that when Anubis lost his mothership, he later showed up with another one, which either means it didn't take long for him to build a new one, or what I think is more likely, Anubis just had a backup. Looking at a battle with these ships present, I think Anubis has just come out better. His shields are better than the standard ones used by the Goa'uld, and it's especially true for his mothership. I can't say for certain if they would be able to stand up to Sokar's weapons indefinitely, but I can see them lasting long enough to do damage, and if Anubis does have 2 motherships and can bring both to bear, I don't really see it being a contest of who wins. Ultimately, I see this war or battle ending with Anubis winning, and unlike with Sokar's victory, this one would be absolute. Granted, Anubis' victory might change depending if SG1 or the System Lords get involved, but I think a definitive outcome is that Sokar dies or is defeated by Anubis. And this is where I want to give my final thought on the difference between these two, at least from my perspective. Sokar was a big threat and did have a cool aesthetic to him and his Jaffa, but that was kind of it. Sure, he had a galaxy-conquering army and fleet, but you could argue that he was just like any other system lord. Fun little detail I wanted to share here. In the show, it was said that Sokar once ruled over the system lords. The show never really explains the timeline or details on this, but the Living Gods RPG does. Now keep in mind, RPG and extended canon might not be canon to the shows and all that, but I find this interesting. There, while Sokar is stated to be a powerful and ancient system lord, it also states that his rule over the others happened because at that time, Ra was fighting Anubis and the Empire as a whole was in this big civil war. He deposed Ra's rule on Earth, but as far as I can tell, that was about it, and he seemed to only had direct control in the lands around Memphis. And the second Anubis was dealt with, Ra turned around and kicked him out. Again, take that lore with a grain of salt. However, I think this, along with what little we know about him, makes me look at Sokar as just another powerful Goa'uld. More sadistic and stylish than the others, but that's about it. Anubis, on the other hand, just felt like a big game changer. A Goa'uld who had advanced technology that took out the Tolan and could go toe-to-toe with the Asgard. That, along with his semi-ascendant nature and connection with the Ancients, just makes me feel like he was a bigger threat than just another powerful system lord who was bickering over power. I said at the start of this video that it felt like the writers did the same story twice with these two, and if I were to expand on that, I'd say Sokar is the first draft. Meanwhile, Anubis feels like the final draft for this concept. I do apologize if this video went from who would win in a fight to like comparing them both in a story sense. It just kind of ended that way. But what do you think? Do you agree with me that Anubis would be the ultimate winner in this fight? Or do you think Sokar can pull out ahead? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe. Follow me on my social medias. And remember,
I control it. I think you will find many things have changed since my return.